Welcome to the Doctor Journal Club podcast, the show that goes under the hood of evidence-based integrative medicine. We review recent research articles, interview evidence-based medicine thought leaders, and discuss the challenges and opportunities of integrating evidence-based and integrative medicine. Continue your learning after the show at www.drjournalclub.com.
Please bear in mind that this is for educational and entertainment purposes only. Talk to your doctor before making any medical decisions, changes, etc. Everything we're talking about, that's to teach you guys stuff and have fun. We are not your doctors. Also, we would love to answer your specific questions. On drjournalclub.com, you can post questions and comments for specific videos, but go ahead and email us directly at josh@drjournalclub.com. That's josh@drjournalclub.com. Send us your listener questions and we will discuss it on our pod. Hello and welcome to another Dr. Journal Club podcast with Josh and Adam. Today we're going to keep it a little bit tighter. We've got some time constraints, so bear with us. We're not going to dive too deeply into research study. But Adam, I did want to take this opportunity to kind of talk a little bit about some discussions I had at a recent conference, and I think that was sort of relevant. We were kind of chatting about that earlier today.
Yeah, which conference was it?
So it was the CRN, so it stands for the Council for Responsible Nutrition, and it was really cool. I was speaking at, it was like a group of industry partners in the supplement industry. And I think what was so interesting to me was the number of people who came up, whether they were clinicians or actually like scientists, like chief scientific officers, and were like, we desperately need this training. One training meaning like how to critically analyze research articles for the clinicians, and then for the scientific officers of industry, it was like, we need to know what your clinicians are looking for so we could design these studies to meet these standards. And as one CSO told me, he was like, look, I'm a biochemist. I know how to write a paper for a biochemistry audience, but not necessarily for clinicians. And so it just kind of really hit me that there really is this need. And I mean, we've spoken about this. And, you know, last thing I'll say as an intro or preamble before we jump in is the thing that really got me interested about this was we were in a little reception before the conference, and a colleague who was also speaking, she was a clinician, great clinician's been doing it for 20 plus years. And she's like, I have this is her words, this chasm in my training about how to critically analyze papers. And she's like, we just didn't have it in school. And that's fair, because when I was going through school, they were just introducing it. So I want to talk to you about like your thoughts on that, the sort of generational thing with training, but also the need for this in practicing doctors like currently, and maybe like, I don't know, what we can do about it, et cetera. And what are your initial thoughts? That just kind of blew my mind when she said that. What do you think?
So a couple things. I mean, I think it's really cool, or not cool, but interesting to hear that like the CSOs are like, hey, we're like biochemists. The way that we're conducting research is going to be way different than what you clinicians need. And that's kind of what I've been harping on for a long time now, of like, I do not care about mechanism of action. Do not show me a mechanism of action paper. Do not discuss it in the paper. I do not care. I don't care, because it doesn't mean anything to the patient in front of me. Yeah, sure, the physiology is cool, and you can try to come up with these theories as to why something is working or justify why you're using it, but you can't justify it, because if we don't have a clinical trial to show that it's safe, efficacious, providing any sort of benefit, you really have nothing to stand on to make that recommendation.
Yeah. If I see one more article about how this product has a little better bioavailability in this format, I'm going to lose my freaking mind.
Yeah, right? And I mean, just like we were talking about last time, of like with curcumin, right, for functional dyspepsia.
Exactly what I was thinking.
For how long have we been thinking about like, oh, you have to take this with a high fat meal and with black pepper, and then we have this great trial showing that like you don't. and they don't even go into that whole like bioavailability thing. They did talk about receptors, which I, frankly don't care about. But I mean, it's also the same thing with medications, right? Like
Yeah.
I don't care that something is a GLP-1 agonist. Cool. Is it going to help my patient with diabetes? Is it going to help them lose weight? Can they tolerate it? Can they afford it? That's what I care about.
Yeah.
Like it's great, maybe, to have that knowledge base as to like how these things are working, and like, yeah, you can come up with a theory of like, well, if things backfire, like why are they backfiring? You need to know that, and I certainly understand that. I certainly understand that, but at the same time, it's just like, okay, um, even if that's the case, we don't actually know if that's why it's happening. Because if those side effects aren't being reported in trials, and trials don't report adverse effects very well, and that's known, um, then maybe we should be creating more trials and being more transparent about looking for side effects and that kind of thing. So, from the CSO standpoint, I think that was really interesting, and hopefully, with that kind of information, it does drive more funding to developing more clinically relevant trials, as opposed to caring if this works on some sort of physiological way.
Yeah.
So hopefully that happens, because they're with almost like all supplements, or at least with the supplement industry, almost all the research is into these mechanism of action studies,
Right.
these rodent models, and then when it comes to clinical trials, vitamin D, they just don't show benefit, and
Yeah.
like that's the reality. And yeah, I mean, I don't know. I think that's really interesting from that standpoint. And then to go on to the
Well, hold on. Let's hang there for a little bit, because I hadn't even thought that we were going to focus on this, but I like this point. And I think that, clearly there's a space for the biomechanics, kinetics of whatever it is you're doing. But I feel like that's early research, like proof of concept stuff. And when you've got, I don't know, $50,000 to do a small trial, like, I personally feel like I would rather see human study with a small n with clinically relevant outcomes, even if it's a feasibility study and your secondary outcomes are clinical. I'd rather see that with like clear clinical outcomes, clinically relevant situation, than some crazy mouse study. I mean, I just feel like that's so much more useful to me. And that was my pitch wasn't against the mouse studies at the conference. My pitch is, because the NIH and the FDA people basically spoke right before me, and I was like, look, like, we don't have $10 million for every time we have a clinical question. Like, we have to, like, they were pontificating about waiting, whether or not you need to wait 10 more years after subgroup analysis shows promise. I'm like, well, that's all well and good, but we're seeing patients in front of us today, and we need to make a decision based on best available evidence. So I would rather have a small n, small trial with humans
mhm.
than a really elegant biochemical design.
Or I would say, the supplement industry just kind of needs to put money where their mouth is and start funding these trials, even if they are industry sponsored. And, we can get into a whole discussion about the issues of industry sponsored research, and kind of the, what comes with that. But if we're only going to rely on, sort of public funding for supplement trials, we're going to be waiting a long time. And so if we want answers fast, and we want to know these things from a clinical standpoint, these supplement companies need to start funding large scale trials.
So that was interesting. So that was kind of my pitch, and I don't know if I've shared this paper with you because I just found it, but it used to be that so we talk a lot about like industry sponsored funding as being a risk of bias, and there's been all this debate in Cochrane over the years, but there's like pretty good meta epidemiologic empiric evidence that studies that are industry funded tend to show rosier effects and less side effects, right? Makes sense. And so that's kind of empiric evidence of bias. Now there's lots of variables and all this jazz, but these were studies done in 2013. But this is cool. I don't think I shared this with you yet. This year, I think a couple months ago, the same group that did all those like primary studies in 2013 at Cochrane did it again, figuring there was going to be better data. And it was actually a meta epidemiologic study where they basically meta analyzed all the other meta analyses that had happened in the past 10 years.
Like a review of reviews almost.
Yeah, but quantitatively, it was
Yeah.
very interesting. And essentially, what they found, which blew my mind, but actually makes a lot of sense, is because what they looked differently this time was funding per se, and then funding where there's funder influence or presumed funder influence, like a employee as an author, or decision to publish, or methodology development, something like that, and then versus just funding per se. And what they found, and this just blew my socks off, is that when you have influence from the funder, yes, that bias is still apparent in the literature, but funding per se is not statistically significant. There's like, you don't see a signal anymore.
Yeah,
And
and
I
that's
just,
what I feel like
yeah,
you and I have been advocating, and me
yes,
more directly, of like,
yes.
and I've been telling people basically since med school of like, don't be a lazy critical. Don't do a lazy critical
I know
analysis.
the word you wanted to say, but don't say
Don't just be
it.
like, oh, it's funded by Pfizer, therefore it's a bad study. It's
Period.
like, no,
False.
read the methodology.
Lazy. Yep.
Someone needs to pay for this.
Yep.
And so if they're paying for it, but everyone's being transparent of like, hey, you know, they funded the trial but had no influence on the decision to publish.
Mm-hmm.
They were involved in the protocol, but the authors had the right to publish. All those things they have those things in place, and you can say, okay, yeah, it was funded, so maybe there's some influence, but they're being super transparent. It's really unlikely that this actually significantly influenced results to a point where my clinical decision is going to be impeded.
Yep.
And
Show me the mechanism, right? Show me
yeah,
the mechanism of the bias. Yeah.
and to my knowledge, at least at HealthGuide at UNM, when we're doing like industry sponsored studies, we kind of have a clause of like, hey, we're publishing this whether we get positive or negative results, and then the supplement company will either say okay, and then we'll go with it, or they'll say we have we have the decision to publish, and then we just say okay, we're not going to do it.
Yeah, we should get Ryan Bradley. Dr. Bradley is the director of research. We should get him on to talk about their process, because they do the level of clinical trials that we're kind of talking about, where like a lot of these supplement companies, they're not going to have $1 million to run a trial, but they might have 50 grand.
Yeah.
Right. And so it'd be interesting to see how that works.
I think the take home is there's no issue with industry sponsorship as long as there's transparency, you know how it's being influenced, and if they are having an influence on the trial data or the decision to publish or these other things, then yeah, you should definitely have some red flags. But if it's just like, hey, we just gave you a bunch of money, or we provided you with just the medication, or we provided you with olive oil,
yeah,
great.
Yeah, so I just think this is fascinating. So I love this paper, because it's funny when you read the conclusions of the paper, and I'll link to it. They were like, well, we don't understand why this is, or we need to do more research, and maybe we're just not seeing the signal. But in my mind, I was like, no, like this is exactly it. There isn't some magic thing that happens when there's industry sponsorship. Like, you need to have a mechanism for that bias to play out. And so it was cool, because I agree. You and I have been talking about this for a while, but it's the first time I've seen empiric proof, or not empiric proof, but empiric support for our position. And because you've always highlighted, some really great New England Journal of Medicine, big pharma studies that you're like, this is a brilliantly designed study, 100% funded by the industry, and yet we're still putting a high value on it. And I think this kind of underlines that fact. So one other thing, I know we're crunched for time, but I just find this area so interesting, is I got sidebarred by a CSO afterwards. And one of the things that was brought up, which I thought was fascinating. So I just find like, I like to work through with the concept that everyone's doing their best and assume the best about everybody. Right. And I believe that in industry, there are really good scientists trying to do their best, right? And so this person struck me as that. And they were like, look, you know what? We really had a lot of faith in our product. We wanted to do research. We tried to do it the way you were suggesting, which is we literally wrote the check we found a good academic center. We've liked their research before. We wrote the check and pieced out. And then the paper was published, and it was a null finding. But when we looked at the methods, we were shocked, because we felt like they totally messed up the methods. Like, they just made errors and da 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 da. And we had this really interesting conversation about, you as industry, like they know their product well, and they've
Mhm.
got really good scientists. Like some of these companies have like over 100 scientists working. Like I feel like pragmatically there should be some communication, right? And so that was it. Just led to this interesting conversation about the pragmatics of this and partnerships where you want to keep arm length distance, but also you need to be realistic about the fact that you may not be the content expert in their product either. And I thought that was an interesting nuance. And so what I told her was like, yeah, man, that's a hard one. And I think, in my opinion, radical transparency and discussion with clauses saying they can either take your advice or leave it is probably the way to go. What do you think?
Well, yeah, I think I would agree with that. I would also say, if you have, um, if you're going to have input in the methodology, because you're technically the content expert, or at least you should be, I think that's fine as long as you're completely blinded to the data. So no
Right.
interim analysis to you. The interim analysis can
Yep.
go to an independent safety monitoring board, just to make sure that participants aren't dying from whatever you're giving them or having significant health consequences. And then so the sponsor should be blinded throughout, and then the sponsor should also not have a decision in publication. It should just be published, whether it's a null finding or not.
So agree. But what about methods development? That was my question.
No, that's what I'm saying. I'm saying that if they have an influence on the methods development, either something of like, hey, here's what we suggest and here's why, or be directly involved with the methods, but have no influence from the data that's coming in, so they can't stop a trial early unless the safety board is like actually concerned. And then if it's a null finding, they still have to publish it, because if they're like, hey, these are the methods that we need to use because we think it'll work, and then you get a null finding, you can't sweep it under the rug. Hey, you had a role in the methodology and you still had a null trial. Like, it just doesn't work.
Yeah, it's so interesting. So I really like these get in the weeds of the pragmatics ethics discussions because I think it isn't as clear cut as I thought. Like when I started my career and I started working at Cochrane and doing reviews for them, rather, I was just like, oh, industry bad, academia good, and like
Mhm.
just the longer I was in real life, the more I realized that was very a naive a position.
Mhm.
And so I do like the more nuance. Look, the thing is, we don't do this for money. This is pro bono. And quite honestly, the mothership kind of ekes it out every month or so, right? So we do this because we care about this. We think it's important. We think that integrating evidence based medicine and integrative medicine is essential. And there just aren't other resources out there. The moment we find something that does it better, we'll probably drop it. We're busy folks. But right now, this is what's out there. Unfortunately, that's it. And so we're going to keep on fighting that good fight. And if you believe in that, if you believe in intellectual honesty in the profession and integrative medicine and being an integrative provider and bringing that into the integrative space, please help us. And you can help us by becoming a member on Dr. Journal Club. If you're in need of continuing education credits, take our NANCIAC approved courses. We have ethics courses, pharmacy courses, general courses. Interact with us on social media, listen to the podcast, rate our podcast, tell your friends. These are all ways that you can sort of help support the cause. And that this kind of brings up another question I want to ask you about. And maybe we'll talk about the chasm later because this has been a really fruitful conversation so far just about the ethics. But one of the things that I worry about still with using academia or CROs, contract research organizations, and I think it bothers me because I'm in forensics and I feel like I worry about the same issue in forensics, which is what is it called? There's a term for it where um, it's like the affiliation bias. Essentially, like you're not directly getting paid for to give a certain opinion. You're not getting paid by industry to only do the research that they want, but there's this unconscious desire to please the people you work with.
Mhm.
And there's this also unconscious and sometimes conscious desire to say, well, I like working with them. And if I give them a result that they like, I'll get to work with them again. Right. And so if you're an academic and industry comes to you with, $100,000 for a study and you do a good study, well, if you do a garbage study, just bad methods, like you don't deserve to keep on going, right? But let's say you do a good study and it's a null finding, right? Like, is industry going to come back to you again to do another study? I don't know. What about in forensics, where you do your due diligence, you do your work, and just like, I don't think there's anything here, right? And you give your opinion, which is what you're supposed to do and ethically required to do. But then maybe they just say, well, you know what? We're not going to come back to you again. And so I don't know. I worry about that. And one of the ways that I've been dealing with it in forensics has been with these a priori registrations, where basically I write down my methods and plan before I see the data and then publish it online. And that keeps, I feel like that keeps me subconsciously honest and make sure that everything is legit. Um, I don't know how you would do that with, I mean, I don't know. Maybe there's a similar mechanism in CROs and in industry.
I think you just have to be honest and be like, hey, before we get this going, this is how we operate. And if you choose to work with us, you're clearly like aware it's in writing, and this is what we're going to do. And it's not our fault if we find a null finding, or if we find a negative result or a positive result. It's just the way it is. But you're going to get 100% from us. It's going to be high quality. Choose to go with us or not. And if you then are a company that's going around and only finding people who publish positive studies, at some point it'll be known, because if someone does a funnel plot,
Yeah.
the publication bias is going to get picked
Yeah.
up. And then if you're noticing it's the same author group every single time, now the integrity kind of goes out the window. And so once you kind of
Yes.
lose integrity, especially in science, it's not coming back from it.
Yeah, I agree. I think the radical transparency is a big one, and I really do think a priori registration of methods is a big one, because, like, for example, with the forensics, we pretty much use the same methods every time, which of course you should if you're doing a systematic review, right? Like, you should use the same methods every time. So when that's out there for the world to see, any deviation from that would be very apparent, I think. And I
Yeah.
feel like, too, if you're an academic and industry is coming to you for a study, like, you clearly have some experience in that space before, or they wouldn't be approaching you, because you're a content expert in that space, hopefully, or at least methods expert. And so if your methods deviate substantially from the norm, I think that would also become pretty apparent. So I don't know. I think there will always be conflicts. Like, that's to be human, is to be conflicted and to have relationships. And I think the more appropriate way to think about this is conflict of interest, disclosure, and mitigation. So, like, you've got
Hmm.
these radical transparencies, you let the reader ultimately decide, but also you have ways to mitigate conscious and unconscious biases from these. And I think registration a priori is a big one.
Yeah. And before we move forward, there's just a couple of things I do want to kind of quickly touch
Yeah.
back on. I know I kind of dunk on mechanism of action and whatnot, but I do 100%, at the same time value what they mean to the scientific community, and they are important. We do need to know, okay, is this even physiologically doing
Mm-hmm.
anything? And there is a process to the scientific method of like, okay, is this compound something that we can identify? How does it work? Where does it work? This way we can develop things from that. What is our expected effects from it? So this way we can design trials, going forward. So I do 100% respect that entire process, and I do value it. But from a clinical standpoint, it's a different conversation. So I'm not saying don't ever do mechanism of action studies, that they're obsolete, or that they're not important or anything like that. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying strictly from a clinical standpoint, they're not helpful.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. As a clinician, I don't get anything useful out of those studies, like zero.
Hmm.
Like, I think you should do enough or make enough of an argument to get your grant or to show plausibility,
Yes.
and then move on, show efficacy or safety,
Yeah.
right? And I understand that small trials are not powered to do that super well, and that's fine. But like I said, feasibility studies with secondary outcomes is something
Hmm.
to use clinically. If it's
Hmm.
designed well, if you've got minimal important differences in mind, things like this, I agree. I think that's so important. And I wonder how much of it is like Adam, it was so I've never been around. I was like in a room surrounded by toxicologists. Like I can't even. It was so interesting. It's like literally everyone there was a top PhD toxicologist,
Mm-hmm.
and that had rose through the ranks or whatever. And I wonder if part of it is when you spent your career in toxicology and chemistry and molecular biology, like that's just the way you see the world. And I get it. I used to be in that world, but clinicians just see the world very differently. And that's just not relevant to us. I mean, maybe it's interesting as a footnote, but that's like the end of it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, yeah, I agree. I think when there was a question at the end was like, what would you like to see from industry moving forward? And that's what I was saying is like clear, I don't care if they're small, but like clear, clinically relevant studies with clinically relevant questions with like clinically relevant outcomes, please.
Mm-hmm.
Like that curcumin study we talked about last time. Like that was just perfect. It was like so clearly set up by clinicians and so completely actionable. And that's what's missing.
Yeah. Two things I do want to kind of briefly touch on, and if we don't have time today to talk about them, that's totally fine. We'll just
Mm-hmm.
have another podcast, which is great. Two things. One, whoever that clinician was, big props to them about the chasm and being and actually acting on it and
Yeah.
trying to be better and learning and wanting to evolve, and not just being a dinosaur and being like, well, we didn't learn it when I was growing up or when I was in school, so
Mm-hmm.
just going to kind of do what I was told and never evolve or move forward with it, because that is incredibly irrational. And just like, if you're starting to question your own beliefs and challenge things and then like evolve as both a clinician, as a researcher and whatnot, that's amazing. That's your own things are only beneficial things are going to happen from that.
Mm-hmm.
And it allows for more healthy, fruitful discussion moving forward. But if you're just kind of stuck in your ways and just going to kind of be like, well, this is what I know and I'm only going to stick to it, that is problematic for a whole host of reasons, and patient care is going to suffer. So, props to that clinician and to all the clinicians out there who, even if they're struggling with grasping things, at least making that effort to get better. So
Mm-hmm.
shout out to them. And then the other thing that I wanted to talk about, or at least if we could briefly talk about it, is the concept of FDA regulation within the supplement industry, because so many people say, oh, supplements aren't regulated by the FDA. And I don't think that is 100% true as a blanket statement. And I don't know if that was brought up at the conference or what your experience was, but to my knowledge is they are regulated, but it's a little bit different than perhaps the pharmaceutical industry.
Yeah, it was super complicated for me. Like, so that's what most of the sessions were on is regulation. And they had these representatives from these national bodies there. And you could tell the contortions that, the industry leaders had to go through to be like, well, we want to show efficacy, but we're not allowed to say it's efficacious for disease or even for prevention
Mm-hmm.
because of the way these regulations are written. And like you could tell that the framework for thinking about this was done decades ago and people are still trying to apply it. And then interestingly, of course, as the quote unquote a definition of disease has changed to like pre-diabetes, for example, what does that do as far as structure, function, claims? And it was interesting, totally over my head. So I don't even know that I could speak to it, except that it was very clear that it was very difficult for industry to try to understand, what the government was looking for. And then to try to hear the government make sense of it was hilarious because it was so clearly not commonsensical the way they were talking about it, and they could,
Well, what
but
else
you
is
could,
new?
yeah, and you could tell them because they are scientists, right? And you could tell that they knew that this was ridiculous, but they were literally trying to apply, these standards that were set by Congress decades ago to anyway. It is really interesting, and I don't understand it at all, and I feel like you need a PhD in regulation to even begin to understand it. So my hat's off to the regulation experts there, but from a scientific perspective, I thought it was interesting. And just super fast, I want to tell this anecdote again about the chasm comment that you made. I just had this wonderful, that was really nailed down for me in my training. I was, I don't know, third year medical student, something like this. And we were in rotations, and there was a senior doctor, 35 years experience, like considered top of his field. Everyone looked, up to him. And what was he doing? He was sitting in his free time, which is hilarious as a doctor, right? Sitting in his free time in Ryan Bradley's rotation rounds, listening to us discuss. And I asked him, I was like, what are you doing here? Like, like clearly you are top of your field and you've got other things to do. And his point was, look, I'm here to learn.
Mhm.
Like I know my stuff, but this whole new evidence-based medicine and critical evaluation stuff that you guys are learning as students, like that's a chasm for you. Didn't use those words, but that's a chasm for me. And you know what I'm going to do in my like lack of negative free time? I'm going to show up with the students, forget hubris, forget
Mhm.
all of that. I'm going to just sit with these students and listen to see new things being learned. That just was so important to me as far as like checking my own chip on my shoulder, my own hubris about learning new things and being open-minded. I just thought that was so awesome.
Yeah. So, listeners, if any of you know of someone or are someone who's involved with like FDA regulations, specifically within the supplement industry, we'd love to have you on and just
Yeah.
have a discussion with you. So, reach out to us, email us. We'd love to learn more about that. And then also anyone who's kind of had this chasm and wants to share their experience, whether you want to just send in like a voice recording as to how things changed, or if you want to have join the podcast with us and be a guest and just kind of talk to us about your experience, your challenges, how you've benefited, where you think things need to improve from. We would love to have you on as well and just kind of chit chat with you and see like, okay, what motivated you to change? How did that change happen? Where are you at now? Because it's important. And I think, we'd love to have you.
I love it. Great idea. And we know Dr. Bill, what's Bill's last name?
Walter.
Dr. Walter and Dr. Garovich, we know we owe you conversations. We were planning on doing it today, but we want to talk about this topical issue, and we're short on time. So in the next couple of weeks, we will cover those. Any other listeners, if you've got specific articles you want us to review or specific topics, you just send it in just like Dr. Walter and Garovich, and we will be happy to discuss it on the pod. Thanks for your attention, and thanks for listening. Take care. If you enjoy this podcast, chances are that one of your colleagues and friends probably would as well. Please do us a favor and let them know about the podcast. And if you have a little bit of extra time, even just a few seconds, if you could rate us and review us on Apple Podcast or any other distributor, it would be greatly appreciated. It would mean a lot to us and help get the word out to other people that would really enjoy our content. Thank you. Hey, y'all, this is Josh. We talked about some really interesting stuff today. I think one of the things we're going to do that's relevant, there is a course we have on Dr. Journal Club called the EBM Boot Camp that's really meant for clinicians to sort of help them understand how to critically evaluate the literature, et cetera, et cetera. Some of the things that we've been talking about today. Go ahead and check out the show notes link. We're going to link to it directly. I think it might be of interest. Don't forget to follow us on social and interact with us on social media at Dr. Journal Club, Dr. Journal Club on Twitter. We're on Facebook, we're on LinkedIn, et cetera, et cetera. So please reach out to us. We always love to talk to our fans and our listeners. If you have any specific questions you'd like to ask us about research, evidence, being a clinician, et cetera, don't hesitate to ask. And then, of course, if you have any topics that you'd like us to cover on the pod, please let us know as well.
Thank you for listening to the Dr. Journal Club podcast, the show that goes under the hood of evidence-based integrative medicine. We review recent research articles, interview evidence-based medicine thought leaders, and discuss the challenges and opportunities of integrating evidence-based and integrative medicine. Be sure to visit www.drjournalclub.com to learn more.